Hello, and welcome to the Fixing California podcast from ricochet.com. I'm your host, Troy Senek, and our guide to both the ridiculous and sublime in California is going to be Lonnie Chen, who is the David and Diane Steffi Fellow at American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution and the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and lecturer in the Public Policy Program at Stanford University. All right, Lonnie, California never stays out of the headlines for too long. It's such a unique place culturally, economically, politically, that the nation never seems to be able to look away for long. But boy, is that ever true now, with what looks at this point almost certain to be a successful effort to force a recall election of the governor, Gavin Newsom. And Newsom, we can intuit, thinks this election is going to happen because he has already shifted into campaign mode. And his response has been to say that this is a Republican recall. He's associated with Donald Trump, with the Proud Boys, with QAnon. In other words, his argument is that this is not only a partisan exercise, but one driven by a partisan fringe. How does that diagnosis match up with your observations of what's happening in California and how the electorate feels?
Well, Troy, I think it's an entirely political response. It's a predictable and a political response, I should say, in that Newsom recognizes what he believes will work and what will not work in terms of pushing back against those who wish to remove him from office. And I think he believes the quickest way to do that is to associate this whole effort with the Republican Party and with Donald Trump and with elements of the Republican Party that might be less favorable or less popular in California. The only problem with that framing is that it's not truthful, and it doesn't really comport with the reality of what's going on, which is that there is broad frustration with Newsom. There's broad frustration with one-party governance in California and what it's brought about. And, I think most recently we're seeing a lot of that through items and issues relating to the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's many public schools in the state. I think something like 75 or 80% of students across the state are still in some form of online learning, or the vaccine rollout, which has been quite slow and has kind of shifted from one direction to another very rapidly without a whole lot of warning, or businesses being shuttered because of relatively opaque requirements or relatively opaque rules about who can stay open and who can close. We have this scandal of the state unemployment insurance system that was driven by really a lack of preparedness that allowed for tens of billions of dollars in fraudulent claims. So, all of these things are problems of mismanagement, problems of oversight, problems of leadership, not problems of partisanship. So I think Newsom wants to frame it the way he wants to frame it. And I think his political advisors have probably given him that advice. And, it's not bad advice. It just doesn't happen to be true in terms of how a lot of people feel. And I think the danger, Troy, is that it alienates people who say, well, look, I'm not some, raving lunatic, but I don't think Gavin Newsom's done a very good job. I don't like the fact that my kids are still learning on Zoom. And so I want to do something about it. And I think that that's actually a significant percentage of people who are opposed to Newsom and who wish to see him recalled.
You mentioned in there the fact of one-party control. And boy, in California, that has been the case for a while now. It's every, I believe, statewide elected office, huge majorities in both houses of the legislature in the hands of the Democrats. And it has been a recurring theme in some of your writing of late, that when we're trying to diagnose the problems besetting California, you're not simply saying, I'm a right-of-center guy. It's run by a bunch of left-of-center guys who have different ideas that I don't like. You're saying that there is something inherent in the fact of prolonged one-party control that is actually sort of weakening and eroding the basic foundational capabilities of the public sector that anybody, Republican or Democrat, would want to work well in California. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think one-party governance for an extended period of time, whether that one party is the Democratic Party in California or the Republican Party as it is in some other states, I think creates significant challenges. And, it's just the reality of what happens when you don't have anyone questioning the status quo, when you don't have anyone willing to step out and say, the people who are in charge are not doing it the right way. And, in California, what that's meant, unfortunately, is that too many Democrats have been unwilling to question what Gavin Newsom has done, what Jerry Brown, his predecessor, did before him, because they're too concerned about currying favor with whoever's in charge. They're too concerned about retaining their own political standing, as opposed to utilizing the independent power that might be given to them. For example, you mentioned, California has these statewide elected officials. It has 8 of them. And all of them have an independent constituency. So the 7 who are not the governor each have their own constituencies. They are responsible for doing their own jobs. And yet they don't do anything but accede to whatever Newsom wants, because politically it's in their interest to do so. And that's just a snapshot of what happens when you have essentially everybody marching to the same tune, everybody from the same party. And the problems that Newsom is experiencing now, his inability to run the state well, the challenges of governance that we see in California, these are things that could have been prevented earlier if there were people in Sacramento willing to hold these folks accountable, willing to say that what the governor is doing, what the Secretary of State is doing, what the other people who are elected statewide are doing, all of the things that they're doing need to be kind of checked and balanced. And we haven't had that in California. And so what we're seeing now is, yes, the byproduct of Newsom being unable to run the state well, but the seeds for Newsom's failure were sowed many, many years ago and have come as a result of this extended period where there has not been anybody to question the status quo, anybody to drive forward with fresh ideas, because the reality is all people are interested in doing is going along to get along, or getting along to go along, I should say.
Let's talk about probably an example of that. So there are a lot of issues in California that obviously split along partisan lines, and then there are others that are unambiguously, regardless of your political ideology, just a matter of pure mismanagement, things for which there is no constituency. And one of the most vivid examples along those lines is one that you mentioned in passing earlier, the fraud that has occurred in the state's unemployment system, which is sort of a scandal twice over, both for its actual occurrence and for the way that state government has handled it. Can you just explain to us what happened here, and perhaps more importantly, how it happened, how it went undetected for so long?
Well, it's a massive fraud. And when people hear about how large of an amount was really the California taxpayer was billed for, they think it's a typo. I mean, the numbers we're talking about are huge. There's been $11 billion in confirmed fraud, with another $20 billion on top of that potentially fraudulent. So you're talking about up to $31 billion in fraudulent payments. So the state unemployment insurance system is run by a department of government called the Employment Development Department, or EDD. And EDD falls under the purview of Governor Gavin Newsom. It is part of his executive office. And actually, it's an interesting story. The woman who runs EDD is a woman named Julie Su, who Joe Biden has nominated to be his deputy secretary of labor. So the woman in charge of this whole scandal, reporting to Gavin Newsom, is being considered for a massive raise, and a massive, certainly raise in visibility, but a massive promotion to be the number 2 person at the Labor Department. And the scandal really started as the pandemic got going last year, and the California economy shut down, which forced a lot of people out of work. And so people started to file for unemployment benefits. And those unemployment benefits were, of course, bolstered by federal assistance that was made available through the first couple tranches of COVID recovery and relief legislation. And as that was going on, and the requests for unemployment insurance were flooding into California, Secretary Julie Su, presumably with the blessing of Gavin Newsom, said, we're going to stop verifying the identities and eligibility of people who are applying for unemployment insurance. And furthermore, we're going to suspend, as this process goes on, ongoing eligibility verifications for people who are applying for unemployment insurance. And so that's really what opened the floodgates. And it opened the floodgates at a time when there were massive numbers of people coming in, but also people, very quickly determined that this could be a pathway to get benefits even if they didn't deserve them. So there's a famous story of one fraudster posing as Senator Dianne Feinstein, actually a former employee of the Employment Development Department, posing as Feinstein to get paid tens of thousands of dollars in benefits. Imagine the surprise when Senator Feinstein found out. But the system itself was so broken because not only were there people getting benefits fraudulently, but there was a massive backlog created of people who needed benefits but couldn't get them, because once there was a problem identified much later on, about 6 months into the pandemic, what the department did was basically to stop all unemployment claims processing. And so this huge backlog then subsequently developed, right? So first you have the original sin of the fraudulent payments. Then you have the compounding of that sin, which was basically saying, well, we're going to stop everything. And so now, fast forward to March of 2021, and you have 1 million people who are in a backlog waiting for unemployment insurance benefits. And, look, are some of those claims fraudulent? Perhaps. But I'll tell you, there are many of those claims that are not. There are ordinary Californians who need help because of the orders to shut down the economies all over the state. People who need help who aren't getting it. So this unemployment insurance fiasco is about the fraudulent payments, yes, but it's also about the failure and breakdown of the safety net in California when it was most needed. I'll just end the thought with this. The California state auditor, a woman named Elaine Howell, who is an unelected appointee of the executive branch, she was asked by the state legislature to do an investigation into all of this. And what the California state auditor determined is that much of this would have been preventable with the right management in place of the department, the right leadership, upgrades of systems, right? All the boring things that technocrats talk about, but are crucially important to make sure that state government is working. And none of that happened. None of it happened because there just wasn't an incentive for political leaders to say, hey, let's do what we need to do to prepare for when the system gets strained, for when we need to do more. And then, as a result, you get this complete fiasco. That's the only way to put it.
Another obvious example of where you've got a state government that is just not really functioning in some senses is the state's high-speed rail system. I'm a native Californian who, like a lot of native Californians, moved out of state. Didn't really want to, but felt like it was an economic necessity. I left California in 2014. That was, I believe, 6 years after the ballot initiative that approved the high-speed rail project had passed. And by then, it was already considered a white elephant. Another 7 years have gone by. Since then, it has not made much progress. We associate, in the abstract anyway, California with a kind of can-do spirit, achieving the impossible. Can you explain why this has gone in precisely the opposite direction?
Well, it's gone in the opposite direction because it was ill-conceived from the start, and of course, it's been poorly overseen. But you're right. I think there is a can-do spirit about California, and I think that's the thing that made it appealing to those who first came to California. I know when my parents moved out to California when I was very young, and we settled in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. They felt some of that allure and draw of California, and I think over time, unfortunately, things like this have eroded people's both their trust in state government, but also their sense that, California is making smart decisions. This high-speed rail project began all the way back, Troy, to your point, when you lived in California, even before then. It started in 2008 and was estimated at the time that to be a project of building this high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco, it would cost about $30 billion. Well, now we know today that project, to complete that project, you're looking at least $100 billion. And the train was supposed to start service when they first talked about it in 2008. They thought, we're going to start service in 2020. Well, obviously that, it still hasn't started service yet, and it's nowhere close to starting service. In fact, they're still working on a small, almost proof of concept a 60-mile section of this bullet train that runs through the San Joaquin Valley from one part of the San Joaquin Valley to another part of the San Joaquin Valley. Never mind the connections to the major urban areas in San Francisco, near San Francisco, and in Southern California. And, we just keep hearing stories of cost overrun over cost overrun. We hear stories of mismanagement within the California High-Speed Rail Commission, within the government agency tasked with overseeing this. We hear reports, for example, most recently that the rail authority awarded a low bid contract to a Spanish company that promised hundreds of millions of dollars in cost savings that still have not materialized 7 years later. And in fact, the actual segment that the contractor was supposed to work on is actually almost $1 billion in the red. So it's an example of poor planning. It's an example of mismanagement. But I think more simply, it's just an example of not knowing when to cut your losses and not knowing when to look at a project and say, you know what, it's not working. This has not been managed well. Let's pull the plug and let's figure out how we can more effectively and smartly spend taxpayer money. And there just hasn't been that conversation because Gavin Newsom has had to stick with this project his predecessor started. And even though I don't think Gavin Newsom is a huge believer in high-speed rail, this gets back to the one-party governance point, Troy. He's not a big believer in it, but he believes that he needs to back up his, one party, his brethren from the same party. And so as a result, you get what you get, which is a project that's completely over budget, past due, and we don't seem to be any closer to achieving the reality of what was originally promised.
Another example of the kind of, I guess you'd call it incompetence that you see in state government. This is one that doesn't make a lot of headlines, but I know that it's a particular bugbear of yours. California has this program that is supposed to provide in-home health care for the elderly. And it has run into a lot of problems, and problems, in fact, that affect the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of it. Can you explain why this is such a hobby horse of yours?
So there is a program in California. It's called the In-Home Supportive Services Program, as you note, and the goal of the program is a relatively worthy one, which is to give kind of in-home care and assistance health care to eligible aged, blind, and disabled Californians. And the goal is to provide care in the home as opposed to having to do it in an institutional setting. And so the program serves, roughly about 600,000 people across the state and includes, about 500,000 providers. And the challenge with this program has always been the oversight of the program and determining whether, for example, payments are going to the right place, whether the program is actually delivering on the promise of providing care to people in home. And, healthcare in California, we could maybe we will spend a whole episode talking about some of the challenges with the healthcare system in California, both our state system for lower income Californians called Medi-Cal, which is our state Medicaid system, as well as some of the challenges with healthcare costs throughout California, which are significant. But this is one of those programs that really, if you think about it, should be a real boon for people, but just has not been managed and overseen in the right way. And here again, the California State Auditor put out a report a couple years ago now that talked about how payments sometimes go to people who are not rendering those services well. So we have fraud in the program. We have abuse of the program, people who make claims that they are providing care that they aren't actually providing. And then there's the question of the reach and scope of the program as well. In other words, there are certain parts of the state that have uneven access to the benefits provided through this particular program. So, here again, this comes down to a question of, is the Department of Social Services, are the departments, the parts of state government that are responsible for overseeing this program, are they doing what they need to do? Are we getting care to those who need it? And too often, unfortunately, the answer is no. That there are many examples of situations where individuals who were supposed to get care didn't actually get the care, even though the state got billed for it. Situations where people have been denied care but should get it, and then broader problems with the program. So it's not so much that the program itself needs to go away, Troy. It's just that it needs to be governed better. We need to have people responsible who are willing to stand up and say, can we do this the right way? Can we make sure that those who really deserve help are getting it, and that we're doing a good job of tracking fraudulent and abusive claims on the system that hurt A, people who should be getting care, and B, those who are paying for it, who the people who are the taxpayers.
Final question for you. To that point, Samuel Johnson's reputed to have defined a second marriage as the triumph of hope over experience. It doesn't seem crazy to think that that's also a reasonable description of expecting much to change in California with the current contingent of policymakers. Of course, over the long run, it's not the policymakers you have to look to, but the voters who put them in office. Beyond the recall, what would your advice be for Californians who are unhappy with the status quo in the state? What elected offices, what issues should they be focusing on if they want to see things get better?
Yeah, there is this tendency to just say, well, if we change the governor, things will be different in California. And look, I think a different governor could do a lot of good. There's no question about it. And I think the current effort to recall Gavin Newsom is a demonstration of people. By the way, the people who've signed the recall petition are not just Republicans. They're independents. There are even some Democrats part of the mix as well, who want something different, who want to see a different kind of leadership. And I think that can be significant. But that's not the end of the story. In fact, it's probably not even the majority of the story, because there are other state officials who are responsible for overseeing good management, overseeing a change in management, trying to figure out how the state can work better. And by the way, telling voters and telling people when it's not happening. I think, for example, about the Office of the California State Controller, which is an office that sounds kind of boring, and a lot of people probably their eyes glaze over. But this is the individual that can be the chief accountability officer, the chief fiscal officer of the state, who can blow the whistle when something's not going right, can do it on his or her own authority, can say, look, I want to go in and audit, for example, the high-speed rail system, or audit the in-home supportive services program, or audit the employment development department, and say, what's going wrong? How can we identify ways of making it work better, and holding people accountable when that's not going on? And that's an example of a statewide position elected by the entirety of the people of the state of California that oftentimes goes under the radar, that people just sort of say, whoever, I'll just pick, whatever person fits the party identification or party affiliation I want, without giving a little bit more thought to what it is that this office does. And I think it's important to inform people and to help them understand how different positions of authority, whether it's the controller's office, in the case of elections in California, the Secretary of State, in the case of what's going on in the schools, the public schools, the superintendent of public instruction. These are all important positions that don't oftentimes get the attention they deserve. And I think it's important to recognize that if the state's ever going to change, whether in the medium term or the long term, it's going to be a change in leadership across many different dimensions. And putting people in office who are going to be able to hold others accountable, but who also themselves will do what they say they're going to do when voters send them there. And I think for too long in California, we haven't allowed that. We haven't empowered the right people, and we haven't held the right people accountable and responsible when things have gone poorly.
You've been listening to the Fixing California podcast with Lonnie Chen. You can follow him on Twitter at Lonnie Chen. That's LANHEECHEN. And if you enjoy the podcast, please rate the show on iTunes or wherever you listen. For Lonnie Chen, I'm Troy Senek. Thanks for listening.
Ricochet. Join the conversation.